Salam alaikum. Mesdames et messieurs, chers collègues, chers étudiants, avant de commencer, donc je vais déjà me présenter. Je suis Dalila Bousta, je suis prof universitaire, pharmacologue, et je suis la directrice de l'Agence nationale des plantes médicinales et aromatiques de Taounet. Alors, avant de débuter nos échanges, je tiens à adresser un hommage particulier aux organisateurs de cet éminent congrès. Leur travail acharné, leur vision et leur engagement ont certainement permis de mettre en place un événement d'une qualité exceptionnelle. Dieu sait que nous, les profs universitaires, on sait très bien combien de temps et d'énergie pour justement qu'on prend en temps et en matière d'énergie pour organiser un congrès international. Voilà, donc organiser un congrès, comme j'ai dit, de cette envergure n'est pas une tâche facile. Et il est évident que chaque détail a été soigneusement préparé et pour offrir à tous les participants, et notamment les invités étrangers, arabes, européens et autres, donc une telle qualité de congrès, une telle expérience enrichissante. Alors du choix des intervenants et aussi à la mise en place de différentes sessions, en passant par la qualité des échanges et de l'accueil, donc j'apprécie énormément et je félicite encore une fois tout le comité d'organisation et à leur tête le professeur Papa. Donc c'est avec un immense plaisir et un grand honneur que je vous souhaite la bienvenue à cette 4e édition internationale de ce congrès, donc Natural Products and Sustainable Development, Health, Food and Cosmetic Applications. Alors c'est dédié aux produits naturels et au développement durable. Ça c'est une terminologie qui est très très importante dans le domaine des produits naturels et notamment des plantes médicinales. Donc nous aurons l'opportunité au cours de ces quelques jours, d'après le programme, d'explorer un ensemble d'aspects, de nombreuses facettes de cette filière et de ce domaine en plein essor et en pleine croissance et transformation. Alors nous aurons l'opportunité certainement de discuter des dernières avancées scientifiques, de nouvelles tendances de transformation, de valorisation des produits naturels, mais aussi des défis qui se posent à nous tous, donc acteurs de ce domaine. Donc, aux agences nationales des plantes médicinales et aromatiques, toute entité qui travaille sur les plantes médicinales et aussi tous les chercheurs et professeurs, chercheurs qui travaillent sur cette filière. Donc, et là maintenant, je vais passer à notre invité. C'est avec un grand plaisir et honneur que je découvre déjà cette référence en tant que directrice d'agence et de discuter, donc c'est avec un grand plaisir et honneur que je découvre cette grande référence et ce grand calibre quand même dans les produits naturels, avec lequel on ouvre le bal avec beaucoup de reconnaissance et beaucoup d'enthousiasme. Donc il va nous donner un bref aperçu, un survol qui est en même temps très détaillé sur son expérience. Donc il y a quand même une très grande expérience approfondie, une expertise incontestable dans les produits naturels. Donc professeur Heinrich, qui a consacré de nombreuses années à l'étude des vertus des plantes et produits naturels et à la promotion des bienfaits des produits naturels. Alors son approche combine à la fois des connaissances ancestrales, mais aussi une vision moderne sur la transformation et l'utilisation des plantes et des produits naturels de manière générale, afin de répondre aux besoins, bien sûr, au final de la santé, du bien-être qui est la cosmétique, et dans le respect de l'environnement et du bien-être. Voilà. Donc au fil de sa carrière, il a acquis une réputation de leader dans le domaine, que ce soit par ses recherches, ses interventions, ou ses collaborations avec des institutions reconnues. Donc aujourd'hui, il va partager avec nous sa vision éclairée et ses recommandations précieuses sur l'utilisation des produits naturels pour améliorer notre santé et aussi notre qualité de vie. Donc sans plus attendre, pour ne pas être trop lente, donc je vais inviter notre invité. On va vous inviter à l'accueillir chaleureusement, professeur Heinrich, donc qui nous apportera son savoir-faire unique dans cet univers fascinant des plantes et des remèdes naturels, avec 3 mots-clés. J'ai lu sa biographie, et en résumé aussi: développement durable, qualité et safety et fondement scientifique. Donc ce sont trois aspects qui sont très très importants dans la transformation et dans la valorisation des plantes médicinales. Donc Professor Heinrich, donc, I invite the people, the audience, to warmly welcome Professor Heinrich, who will bring us his unique expertise in this fascinating world of plants and natural products. The floor is yours, Professor Heinrich. Thank you very much.
Shukran, merci bien, and it's a great pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Morocco, and let's see whether we can get the presentation up. Here we are. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a great honor to be here, of course. But it's also a great pleasure, and I used yesterday to explore the city a bit. What I want to do today builds very much on what has been said in the opening ceremony about sustainability, what happens post-Nagoya. Some of you may know that we've done a lot of work on implementing Nagoya in various countries. I've never done this in the context of Morocco with one small exception, so I'll talk about all these things. However, before I start, I just want to take one moment to commemorate a great retired colleague, Professor Dave Philipson, who many years ago was very active in the field and who passed away just under the age of 90 years a few weeks ago. Right, I also would like to draw your attention to two of the congresses which are coming up this year and next year, organized by the Society for Medicinal Plant and Natural Product Research. Chaîne Naples will take place at the end of August of this year in the Italian city of Naples. You can no longer submit abstracts, but it will be a very exciting event with over 850 submitted presentations. But plan for next year. Next year is in a French-speaking region in Reims, in France, so there may be a good opportunity for you to network. Now, what I'm doing today is really thinking about sustainability and how we can use this in development. And I think it's fair to say that in research, we are very often focused on one area. What you see here are the sort of four areas which I see as essential parts of, in the broader sense, natural products in the development of new high-value products, ethnopharmacology, medicinal plant research. We obviously start out with some modern or traditional knowledge and the way these are used as functional food, as medicine, etc. There's a huge area which I think is very often neglected, that's quality and composition, and we will come back to this later. And there's the main theme of this congress, sustainable uses, sustainable development, sourcing, appropriate value chains which provide benefits to primary producers. And last but not least, we have the whole area of pharmacology. If you look at the modern literature in the field, it's fair to say that 90% are in this area. However, I would argue that we really need to put more emphasis on the other three areas. That's why, in my view, all three should be highlighted as something we should actively be involved in and keep doing. Now, let's move on first to drug discovery. It was mentioned earlier in the introduction, and I have a few examples here. The first thing I need to say is we all need to remember that the current pipeline of drug discovery, irrespective from where substances come from, is in essence dry. You speak to the big companies, they're all saying we don't have enough in the pipeline. Why is this? Well, I think there are many reasons, and we don't have to discuss the reasons outside of our field, but we need to focus on some of the aspects which are crucial in the context of natural products. One is experts pose unique challenges, and we'll come back to this later. And there are issues with the reproducibility of pharmacological research. It's now 20 years ago that Johnny O'Neill's published this paper where he argued that the majority of pharmacological experiments are non-reproducible. Now this was not about natural products, not about plant extracts. But we need to keep this in mind when you think about our work. What is a meaningful approach? And I can see we have some interesting round tables here. So how meaningful can docking studies be? What do we need to do to have good docking studies? And I just want to jump to one other aspect. I think we seriously need to think about regulatory affairs. Regulatory affairs are important. We are currently suffering from too many products on the market which are of inadequate quality as poorly regulated medicines. As a sideline, there's a paper we published recently, and if you're a newcomer to the field, this paper in front of you in natural products might be quite interesting. So let's start our little journey, and the first example I'm bringing to you is something we've been doing for quite a few years, looking in essence what is the basis we need to have for developing new drugs on the basis of biodiversity. The take-home message here is that if you look at what has been done so far in research, miss out on a very important biological part, and this is the abundance of a species. This is the availability of a natural product to be used in medicine or as a supplement or as a cosmetic. I'll come back to the GBIF later, but in essence, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility is a facility hosted in Sweden which provides you detailed information on the distribution of species globally. And this is an important tool we need to consider. These are the two papers I'm referring to, and you'll see the examples in a moment. Now, what's the problem? The problem is, if you look at the traditional use, the traditional tools and the traditional rules used in drug discovery for natural products, they are for many reasons not appropriate, but they are used to argue against natural products. You see some of the key ones here and what's traditionally involved, log P, molecular weight, hydrogen bond acceptors, etc. I don't have to repeat this because we all know the basics. However, the point is that these metrics are in many ways in the natural products areas missing. And what's the main one being missed out? So what we did is we looked at alkaloid-bearing plants and their distribution using GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Center. You see here the first and the last alkaloid which entered the pharmaceutical market. Morphine and related compounds from poppy, no doubt, and galantamine from the snowdrops, snowflakes, and the like. Obviously, for a cognitive decline, introduced onto the market now 25 years ago. Here's an image or two images of galanthus mahoni in this case, and the main active metabolite, galanthus. This is a core slide, and what I want you to understand in this context is the importance of comparing species which yield alkaloids used in medicine. That's basically on top. It's called a medicinal alkaloid only. These are 52 species. And all the other non-medicinal yielding alkaloid species are 24,200 and something. So we compare the abundance, the occurrences of these two classes of, if you want, alkaloid-bearing plants. And what you see there is, if you only focus on the right-hand side, data 2020, you see that we have 60,000 occurrences for the medicinal alkaloid-bearing species, and the non-medicinal ones are 11,000. So roughly a six-fold higher abundance of species which yield alkaloids used for medicine. On the left-hand side, data 2014 tells you about the situation when we did the first paper now over 10 years ago, but the message is in essence the same. So, one of the starting messages for sustainable development is don't focus on the rare and endangered species, focus on the more abundant one, which I think is very often neglected. To highlight how it looks like, I'm using again galanthus as an example. You see the GDIF data in the form of a map here, and you can see that it's very widely distributed in the northern hemisphere. It doesn't quite reach Morocco in this case, but you certainly find it in Central Europe, Northern Europe, and in North America. Importantly, most of these occurrences are based on cultivation, very often as ornamental. And the native range is much more limited. And I also should point out that galanthine obviously is different today in two ways. One, it serves from a large range of related species, and secondly, obviously, it's now possible to synthesize. But the message in the development, when it was developed into the medicine, is it already was a relatively abundant species. Now, let me move on to the next topic, and I think that takes us a bit beyond the discussions earlier. I've been thinking for a long time what we as a field have to do in the context of today's challenges with climate change. And if I look at what we did at different congresses, including in Krakow, the Seven Society meeting, including other congresses, there wasn't a lot going on, and there's a very limited set of data on climate change and how it impacts on the whole area of medicinal and other high-value plants like nutraceuticals and cosmetics. This is a very recent paper which actually came out at the end of last year, and we are looking at what impact climate change has in the context of our specific examples of medicinal and high-value plants. Now, I don't need to tell this, but I think it's important to remind us we have been very successful in destroying ecosystems globally. This is a Greenpeace map I like to use. Obviously, we know that the Northern African region was deforested 2 millennia ago, but we more recently have seen all sorts of changes. Europe has been very successful in destroying its primary forests, very sad, as has been most of North America, especially the United States, as has been Brazil in the Amazon, as have been regions in Southeast Asia, China, and the whole area of the Russian Federation and neighboring countries. So the question is, how is this going to impact on developing new high-value products? The simple answer is we don't know. Going back to my previous argument, obviously, I would not argue that you should search for new products which are rare, endangered, rainforest species, but think about more widely used and available species. But in essence, we don't know it. So here's the concept that we are proposing. It's a concept which I have been struggling with for at least 5 years, and I'm happy to develop it further. But I think if we want to understand what we need to do at the level of an individual plant or fungal species, then in essence 4 areas we need to understand, and which we have not conceptually done. One area is what I said earlier, it's the weediness, or the opposite, the rarity. How easy is it to reproduce a species? The other one is the habitat, and linked to this is the habitat loss. So this is in essence how widely is it found? Is it only an abundant species in a part of Morocco, or is it widely available, let's say, in regions around the Mediterranean? We have issues associated with climate and climate change, and I'll come to some examples in a moment. How does climate change impact on what we want to produce as a farm? And you have the bioeconomy, what I have called boom and bust products, that people are putting things on the market without considering sustainability right from the beginning, with a subsequent collapse of the market. Now, these are fundamentally two types of questions. One are more what I would call biotic, nature-based aspects, the bottom ones, and others are anthropogenic, driven by us, bioeconomies and climate change certainly. However, obviously there's an overlap, and I don't want to see this as a very strict distinction. And the take-home messages, we need to think about what is needed in terms of understanding the requirements for developing a product from a specific plant. Part of this is the socio-economic framework. I'm not going to talk about this a lot, but that's important. These are the 7 species we have looked at. Maybe in the context of Morocco, especially saffron is of interest, so I will focus on this one. But we have basically taken examples from 5 of the 6 main continents which are inhabited, including Rhodiola, which poses some very interesting challenges, but also Australia, frankincense, which obviously also is very relevant in the southern Mediterranean. This is the example of Crocus sativus, and while you may not see all the details, I'll give you a summary in a moment. What I want you to understand is we analyzed each of these aspects individually. So we look at the habitat, and if you look at saffron, there are actually no major issues with saffron, also because it's a cultivar system. The reproductive success is not a concern. It can be produced quite easily by propagation. Climate change now has a major impact on saffron production. Regions which traditionally were very successful in producing saffron today are suffering because of changing climate conditions. And the bioeconomy, overexploitation is another factor, but not that essential. So we used a very simple traffic light system, red, yellow, green, to highlight these challenges. This is the summary, and what you see here is that we highlight exactly that research and development in this case will need to focus on how we overcome climate change related issues. Now, one discussion that I've had recently is to introduce vertical farming, artificial production for saffron production. So the solution may not be a natural one, it may not be based on field production, but that's exactly the kind of research and development we need. I have an example here on Morocco, and there's one interesting case study by Moussavari et al. In the Atlas Journal of Biology, and they looked at the challenges and opportunities. The paper is a bit older, so I can't really tell you what has happened in the last 8 or 9 years, but it highlights that there are definite changes, including the reduction in the yield of stigmas and many other challenges associated with production, specifically in the Atlas Maroc region of Morocco. I'll be very brief with Aquilaria agarwood, a very famous one, very important as an aromatic cosmetic product. Medicinal use is actually secondary, and you see a similar situation. Here, however, the main challenge is in the bioeconomy and overuse of this product. So, the bioeconomy is the main topic we need to focus on. The natural habitats are relatively reasonable, and the reproductive success also is robust. There are issues with climate change, more vulnerability of the species, but the key challenge is the bioeconomy. So this is the summary, the assessment, and you see exactly the same approach. So what my take-home message of this part is really we need to think about things differently, and we need to develop a sustainable use covering all aspects of medicinal plant use and production. And if I say medicinal plant, it includes cosmetic plants, nutraceuticals, and other high-value products. So we need to look at these 4 factors: habitat, habitat loss, reproductive success, climate change, and the bioeconomy. And it's not a summative process, it's most likely not additive, but if we have more than one impacting it, it's exponential. Let me give you an example which is not a medicinal plant, even though we do use the wine leaves medicinally in Europe and I guess also in Morocco. But it is interesting because the food sector has spent much more time thinking about these things, and there are more papers looking at it. And I'm using this paper as an example, Löwen et al., which was published last year, because I think it highlights very dramatically the issues. They looked at different aspects of how wine production and wine biology will change. Vitis vinifera, traditionally, obviously, if you look at the European side, which is a rather distorted map on the right-hand side, what you see is all the red dots point to areas where wine production is at risk or will suffer changes. So if you love wine from across the Mediterranean in southern Spain, it's unlikely that this wine will be produced with the same quality and the same quantity in a few years. Instead, maybe you get some wine from southern Britain, because these are the areas which are opening up for wine production. The same is true for Ireland, potentially. The same is true for some parts of northern France, northern Germany, Poland, etc. So the point is there's a geographical shift, and these authors have demonstrated it in this paper. There's more. We need to think about the phenology. What you see here is the current, the future, and the sort of mitigating situation. What can we do about wine production if we bring the increase in temperature down? In a nutshell, the flowering is earlier, the harvest is earlier, and the overall production period is short. So again, there are different scenarios. I don't want to go into details, but I think it demonstrates very dramatically how these things are going to change at all levels. There are interesting changes to the morphology. This is a prediction of how the root system and the above ground parts are looking like. There will be a lower production of wine, the leaf mass will be lower, there must be a more extensive root system. So they really predict all sorts of later changes. And if you like wine, which doesn't matter here, and you have another problem, because the taste is going to change, with a higher temperature, there's an increased risk of microbiological spoilage, and they claim that the flavor will shift to override or cooked food aroma. That's obviously phytochemistry. That tells us why we need to think about the impact also on the chemistry. So, this is, I think, a good example highlighting what we need to understand and what we need to do also in the field of high-value products coming from plants, which are not major food items like wine, coffee, and the like. I just briefly want to mention one project here, which we haven't yet published, only in an abstract so far in Panthamerica. This is a study we did on Anacyclus purpureum, the variety purpureum. And it's an interesting one. It's a local product, very important to the economy of the Atlas Mountains. And we haven't done this analysis you saw a moment ago, but I think it's very interesting to see also that we have all these challenges. In this case, there definitely is an overexploitation. The demand is too high, so the bioeconomy is driving important change. Back to my map from earlier. So what do we need to think about in the future? Obviously, I highlighted some research needs. But I think there's something else which is quite interesting to think about. We have a huge drive for carbon capture. And there's this interesting paper which was published in Nature a few years ago, which highlights that secondary forests are actually ideal for capturing carbon dioxide. And there's a push to reforest large areas in Europe, in North America, in South America. I'm sure there are activities in the southern Mediterranean. I know there are activities in China. So that's an opportunity. And my argument is what is missing in this paper is in essence that we also need to think about what implications this has for the local populations. Can we offer them something? Can we offer non-timber forest products from these forests, which they can sell? So should there be projects, if there's a reforestation program, right from the beginning to develop products which can be used in handicraft, as medicines, as food supplements in the cosmetic industry, broadly speaking in this region, obviously, as aromatic substances. So I think there are opportunities we haven't thought about and we need to think about. So my take-home message from this part is we need to put far more emphasis, and we need to put this as the foundation of research, to think about sustainable sourcing, also benefits, something I've not covered, and the primary material. Now, the next example I'm giving you is not primarily and directly linked to climate change, even though there are some important aspects linking it to climate change. I'm going to talk about lavender species. I'm sure that's not a very novel topic to you, but we just published a paper a month ago which highlights some very specific and unique challenges, which to some degree also link to climate change, but also to the bioeconomy. So I'm not going to talk about the details, but from a European perspective, what's interesting, we obviously have all the cosmetic products and we have medicinal products. One of the most successful classes of products in recent decades has been lavender-based products as calming agents. There's a large number of clinical trials available. You see some of the data from Trial Search of the WHO and the clinical trials here. So there's a huge interest, again, in the clinical and pharmacological aspects. There are lots of commercial species, products available, and again, what are we missing out on? And what we did here for the very first time in this context, we looked at the pharmaceutical performance of lavender-based products. So we took a very pharmaceutical approach, trying to understand what is happening in case of soft gel, hard gel, and tablet formulations in terms of their pharmaceutical performance. In other words, to put it in a very simple way, can the product actually be used pharmaceutically based on the existing evidence data on its pharmaceutical performance? These are some of the products we looked at, and you will say some of them look more like pebbles and not like pharmaceutical formulations. And to summarize it very bluntly and not very scientifically, some of them perform like pebbles. They are non-dissolvable, and we'll come back to this in a moment. So the question was, how do these products perform in pharmaceutical performance testing, and what are the differences between unregulated and regulated products? In a nutshell, unsurprisingly, regulated products perform as expected because they have to go through this process. Unregulated products, unfortunately, do not. And you see the key data here for soft gel capsules, hard gel capsules, tablets. Overall, about a third do not fulfill the criteria of the European Pharmacopoeia performance testing in terms of solubility. We also looked at the chemistry, and for illustration purposes, I'm only showing the HBTLC because that's visually very clear. And there the situation is even more dramatic. 70% roughly do not comply with the requirements. Here is the quantification, in this case for the soft gel capsules with a marker compound. So to summarize this part, we have more data which I'm not showing. We have huge issues with the performance of unregulated products. And this has a huge impact on consumer and patient trust. There's a huge impact on the expectation of the competent authorities, etc. Now, coming back to climate change, what is the link there? Actually, there are issues. If you think about the traditional areas of growing lavender, what comes to your mind? For European mind, it's the Provence in France. And they are currently struggling because of long, dry summers, increased pest load, and other problems associated with the production of this species. So climate change also impacts this further in terms of the challenges we face. Yeah, so moving on very fast, I want to come to an area which is very close to my heart. I mean, I'm very happy that someone in this audience is Olivier Potarat from Basel, who is one of the co-authors of this paper I'm going to discuss now. And this is also a concern I have as an editor of especially Frontiers in Pharmacology, where we receive too many papers which are non-reproducible because the composition is not reported or poorly reported. I call this research on Florida Hub. Now, some of you may know German and you may know what I'm referring to, but otherwise it will be a complete enigma to you. So we're starting with the basic nomenclature, something we did well over 10 years ago, the chemical composition, and all these aspects. There's a lack of reporting in the scientific literature, making research non-reproducible. Remember what I said in the beginning about John Ioannidis and the problems with the reproducibility of pharmacological research? That's exactly the issue in a wider context. This is the paper which was published 2 years ago now, actually now 3, in Frontiers in Pharmacology, and the content guidelines have been accepted by several journals and are ongoing in their implementation in various other ones. So I hope that these will help to overcome these challenges. I can't go through the details, but I just want to highlight what we did. We had a core group of people, and you see the core ones here. I mentioned Olivier. We had colleagues from South America, South Africa, China, experts with a background in analytical chemistry, editors, industrial analytical experts, and the like. And what we did here is we analyzed the need for how the extract composition needs to be reported. To summarize our data, we are proposing 3 levels of detail in terms of reporting. So instead of starting with a chemical definition, we are saying if you want to report, or if you report on an extract, step number 1 must obviously you need to provide all the fundamental biological data. Where was it collected? Plant parts, species, more details on the extraction process. But then, in terms of the extract you use, if you're using a plant which is regulated in a pharmacopoeia, you need to comply with the pharmacopoeia, which is on the far left-hand side, and you need to provide a reasonably detailed characterization of the extract used. I'm not going to go into the details, you can find this in the paper. If you use a plant which is generally used as a supplement, something like goji or other ones, we basically require the same chemical fingerprint if it is used commercially, especially if it's used to a large scale. And if you do a novel plant which has hardly ever been studied, I think it can be much more limited. So our approach here comes from a regulatory perspective. What do you need to do to have an optimal description of the plant material, ascertaining reproducibility? I can't go through the process, but I want to say that the first step was a community consultation. Obviously, I can't tell you whether anyone from Morocco or Algeria, Tunisia participated, but we had quite a few participants from the southern Mediterranean. Oh, thank you. From the southern Mediterranean region, and we also had many from Europe, fewer from countries further east, and very few from China, unfortunately, but that's what it is, and many from ASEAN countries. So we had a relatively broad spread of feedback. We then had a Delphi process where the team I showed you agreed on what's the best approach. always in dialogue with key stakeholders, and then we formulated this proposal, which was then assessed by a group of other stakeholders, like experts in analytical chemistry, taxonomists, colleagues who are leaders in their respective fields, as journal editors and so on. So, it defines these aspects, and I mentioned this earlier: plant material, origin, composition, experimental approach, and transparent report. And it remains shocking how little this is very often recognized. And again, as an editor, obviously one challenge I see is that we now have lots of colleagues who have great expertise in one field of science to say something new from ecology, but they don't speak to the neighbor a few rooms further down, offices further down in the corridor, about the pharmacognostic, about the phytochemical aspect. So it calls for far more detailed collaboration. These are the details we are doing. In essence, if you think about it, it follows the fundamental principles of the consort statement, the reporting of clinical trials. So I hope that this will have an impact in increasing the reliability of studies, and thus ultimately the impact of our field in producing good science. Now, it's a consensus statement. There are limitations. One limitation is there's never been going to be 100% consensus. I have to say the team and the feedback we got showed a very high degree of consensus. Some were saying you're asking for too much, and I think that's all a question of flexibility, how we handle it. But I think it provides guidance, and it really is presented, it's really intended for us as authors, reviewers, and editors of journals to use it and to improve the quality of the output. We have an open access tool I want to highlight. You see the barcode or the QR code on the right-hand side. So you can directly go there and look at it. The QR code, in essence, provides you with a tool to assess what is needed and what you have done. And this is then transformed into a PDF, which you can submit with your paper as documentation of having done it. So, these guidelines are the first of its kind. We are happy to discuss details, we are happy to look for improvements, and we acknowledge some limitations. I highlighted what I think is a core achievement, that is the usability will be increased. We hope that the division into different levels will make it more feasible to actually do it, because if you're studying plant extract, which is used in the pharmacopoeia, you must have the infrastructure to look at pharmacopoeial and analytical aspects. I said earlier we need more interdisciplinary collaboration and training. I also said earlier there was not a complete consensus, and there are some gaps. The most important gaps I see right now are polysaccharides, where a different approach is done, and we need to think about this. And the other one is oligopeptides, which also are a problem. Right. Thank you to the core team. And with this, I'm really coming back to my initial argument here, and this is that we need to think about these other aspects. And if you are doing studies, especially clinical studies, pharmacological in vivo and vitro studies, aspects like the other three main areas are absolutely crucial to be covered. Right. I'll be nearly done, so I hope I can give you another bit of insight in a moment. I just want to speak very briefly on one of my main activities outside of my role at the School of Pharmacy at UCL in London. And this is, as I mentioned before, the editor-in-chief of Frontiers in Pharmacology from the section of the pharmacology. Now, we receive about 3,500 to 4,000 manuscripts a year. It's now a huge number, and we are certainly very successful in this regard. But as all journals, there are important challenges and important points to be considered. This is a bit of a background. The interesting thing about Frontiers in Pharmacology, it's a journal divided into about 18 sections. One of them deals with medicinal plant extracts and pure natural products, metabolites. That's now the largest section. As I said, the section alone receives about close to 4,000 manuscripts. That's anticipated this year. We have a sort of decentralized editing structure, but the central hub for decisions and the ultimate decision lies with me. And I just want to highlight a few little things which I think are very important today. One of the great concerns has been reproducibility. I mentioned this before, and quality. And one of the, I think, strong aspects of the Frontiers peer review system is that it has an extremely high level of assessment of the quality. There is the AIRA, Artificial Intelligence Research Assistant. It's rather sad to say that based on AIRA, about 30% of the manuscripts automatically are rejected. They're not rejected by AIRA, but the flag raised by AIRA is so strong that the decision is we will not proceed. It's a very large number, but a very successful element of making sure that only good quality papers go into peer review, or better quality. What is spotted? The obvious thing people always talk about is plagiarism and illicit activities, but a lot of this actually is poor quality, illegible figures, etc., but also non-compliance with basic criteria. So one of our fundamental criteria, for example, is we do not want study on endangered species without justification. So all these things are more or less automatically then going through, or end up as a reject. We have, then it's assigned to the editor. I do the next screening, and again, sadly, quite a large number do not make it to the next stage. And the remaining about 30% of all journals, then 30% of all manuscripts going to peer review. One thing I want to say, and I'm very conscious of this, especially in the context of Morocco, obviously there's a cost implication of open access. Now, Frontiers has implemented this point system, at least for pharmacology and 5 other journals. So if you do a peer review, or if you're an editor and handle a manuscript, you accumulate points, and with these points, you reduce the costs of the next publication. It's actually quite significant after about 15 peer reviews or 20 it is, and, or handlings, you can then publish a paper without a direct cost for you. Which I'm using actually because my university doesn't pay for open access. Papers need to be valid, but the details are here, but this covers the experimental design, the plausibility of the argument, the quality of the language, and the various aspects related to ethics. Integrity is really the core, and I think again that's where Frontiers has a very high ethical standard, and I hope that we keep it up. And again, I'm very happy for criticism, comments, improvements. We live on the basis of a dialogue or moving. I also want to highlight this, that we have a set of very specific requirements, and I'm not going to go into it, but it is linked to Nagoya. We recently had to reject a paper where the authors tried to get retrospectively the approval from a competent authority that the material was exported legally. They exported in good faith, but the paperwork was never completed. As a consequence, sadly, in the end, this paper had to be rejected because we did not get the required documentation. We have a very strong commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals. That's the purpose of research. It's not about publishing, it's about contributing to better healthcare and sustainable development. With this, I'm coming to an end. As you will guess, this is a group work. I'm very grateful to my group. The work I've presented today relies very heavily on Banas Khalil, who was leading the project on the conflict statement and also the Lavender project. She was a postdoc. The project in Morocco, I mentioned very briefly, involved Francesca Scotti and colleagues here from the Atlas Mountain region in Morocco. I mentioned the conflict team, and I have a very large group, and my main lab activities are centered around the treatment of wounds and inflammation, but that's something I wasn't able to cover today. Just to highlight, some of the funding we received, including for the Morocco project, has been via the UK Starboard Fund, which could be an interesting opportunity to explore for collaboration, because it basically focuses on sustainable development and protection of biodiversity in a collaborative way with one country and the United Kingdom. With this, thank you very much, Kupra, again, and as I said, it has been not only a pleasure but also an honor to be here, and thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Heinrich, for this excellent presentation. And I'm trying to summarize some points or some aspects in this presentation. In the beginning of the presentation, Professor Heinrich summarized different points or different aspects that limited this kind of this valorization of plant. For example, the time and effort from valorization of plant to lead and finish product is perceived to be too long, and the cost also is high. Extract as active pulls the limit of reproducibility. So what else? Sourcing and resourcing of materials is also a big problem in this field. In Morocco is the same. The regulation based on Nagoya protocol is perceived as being too high, and for this discipline, plant valorization, we need different disciplines. We need a pharmacologist, phytochemist, and botanist in the beginning of the Chaîne, and different disciplines. So it's so complicated. And also the stakeholders are not interested in natural products. That's a big problem for professor, for researcher, or for also for agency that valorize this kind of topic. So we mean by that industrial, pharmaceutical industrial, or also Ministry of Health. Extracts are difficult to be approved as medicine. That also is a big problem. And this is a fast way. There is a fast way via food supplements. That is an advantage in this case. And there is also a lack of experts. Il y a un manque énorme dans la chaîne de la valorisation des plantes médicinales aromatiques, et notamment les disciplines de la botanique et les disciplines des pharmacognostes et des pharmacognosistes. Ça aussi, c'est un problème qu'on rencontre au Maroc. Donc, le professeur Heinrich a aussi soulevé un certain nombre de points qui sont très très importants au niveau de la recherche, et notamment ceux de travailler sur les alcaloïdes. Alors la plupart des chercheurs travaillent, la plupart, si ce n'est la majorité, ou on va dire les 99%, ils travaillent sur les polyphénols, les flavonoïdes et les huiles essentielles. Ça aussi on le rencontre aussi, donc c'est aussi une idée commune avec professeur Heinrich. Donc il a soulevé le fait de ne pas travailler sur les alcaloïdes, et ça c'est très important. Alors on a deux alcaloïdes, trois ou quatre, qui sont très connus jusqu'au jour d'aujourd'hui, la morphine, la vincristine, la vinblastique et d'autres molécules, mais aussi il y a une plante qu'il a soulevée, donc qui est très intéressante, qu'on retrouve dans l'ornemental au Maroc, qui peut être aussi une source de galantamine qui est une substance qui agit énormément et qui agit sur le récepteur de l'acétylcholinestérase, qui peut aider énormément dans les maladies cognitives et notamment l'Alzheimer. Alors donc il y a un certain nombre d'aspects sur lesquels il a mis l'accent, et notamment tout ce qui est développement durable et tout ce qui est fondement scientifique et qualité et safety. Il a soulevé un guideline qui est très important, c'est celui de... Bon, je vais revenir sur sa présentation, voilà, qui est très important, et on va poser des questions après, parce que j'ai une question aussi. C'est celui du CONFI-AMP, donc qui est aussi une guideline qui fait toute la démarche de valoriser la plante avec une reproductibilité et aussi avec une caractérisation chimique qui est sûre pour pouvoir arriver à la fin à des extraits ou à des actifs à base de plantes ou à base de produits naturels qui sont très standardisés. Voilà, donc j'ai résumé, mais rapidement pour ne pas monopoliser la parole, un certain nombre de choses qui m'ont paru très importantes au niveau de sa présentation. Il a aussi rassemblé toute son expertise au niveau de l'ethnopharmacologie jusqu'à l'extraction, jusqu'à la caractérisation chimique. Donc vous avez vu à la fin, son équipe, c'est une équipe pluridisciplinaire, et ça aussi c'est très important, donc de joindre toutes les compétences au niveau du Maroc, qui va de la botanique jusqu'à la pharmacie, jusqu'à pharmaceutique. Voilà, donc je laisse peut-être l'audience, donc si vous avez des questions à poser au professeur Heinrich, donc je pense du moment que la traduction elle est là, vous pouvez peut-être poser vos questions, donc en arabe, en français ou en anglais, quand vous voulez, mais si vous pratiquez l'anglais correctement, donc vous pouvez le faire. Voilà, donc la parole est à l'audience. Il y a des questions? I think that is clear. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Professor, for your talk, excellent talk. And being essentially interested in crocus sativus, I've been working on crocus sativus and biodiversity and all this valorization of this very interesting product.
Can you go a bit closer to the micro, please?
A bit closer, it'll be, well, this is the closest that I can be, actually. Well, I was saying that I'm being interested in saffron, crocus sativus, and working on that plants for years. And given the observed disparities of the disparities of crocus sativus production, such as the Iran's resilience versus Kashmir and Morocco's decline, how can you see the integration of the ethnopharmacological knowledge and the local agricultural practices to ensure long-term sustainability for crocus sativus, such as culture and medicinal resource? Thank you.
Thank you. Just to be sure, you're talking about saffron. Okay. Thank you. I think the example of Kashmir and adjoining regions is a very interesting one because it impacts on the livelihoods of the people there. Now, we have seen in recent years, not decades, in the last few years, an increasing production of saffron in countries where historically it wasn't very important. I had the paper I mentioned earlier actually was led by a refugee from Ukraine who came with a government grant from the UK government, actually a charity, and she started work on saffron because in Ukraine they were suddenly able to grow it at a larger scale than before, and it was much easier to produce it there now than it was 20 or 30 years ago. So it shifts, again, it's a shift to the north. It's a very similar thing to what I showed you with the example from the literature on wine. Kashmir, Iran, Saudi Arabia, they all are now, as it seems, but the data are not very clear, not very strong to my understanding. They now have all issues with struggling more with production. The same is true for lavender, it moves north. So, unfortunately, we are faced with a situation that I think there will be regions where it will no longer be possible to produce saffron. Or it will only be possible if we change the way it is done. Now, I'm not an agronomist, I'm not an expert on what needs to be done there, but definitely there will be regions which are very much affected by a lack of opportunities today or in 10 years compared to 10 years ago. How this impacts on the global situations and everything is, I forgot my magic glass to tell me what the future looks like, but I'll try to find it when I'm back home. It's impossible to say, but I think we need to address it. With my background both in molecular biology and, in this case, importantly, anthropology and medical anthropology, I'm just very conscious of the impact this has on local populations. Lavender, the same is true for some of the other examples I showed you. But to give you a positive example, which I found very interesting, coming from a colleague who has a lot of expertise in working in Korea and Japan. In Korea, they have a very interesting system which is being revitalized to produce ginseng. And they have these forests, and in the forest they plant ginseng. So instead of the ginseng production, which is under a shaded roof in a large quantity, they put in individual plants in long rows in a forest, let it grow there for 8 or 9 years, or 7 years, which is shorter than the natural regeneration, and then harvest it. So it's then labeled in Korea as wild identical ginseng, yielding a higher income for the local population. So I think we need all these innovative solutions, and they need to come from the people who are affected by it. To bring it back to Morocco, what we did in the Atlas Mountains, we need the people there to decide how this can best be done with some sort of a semi-cultivation. Just to give you another example.
Je ne sais pas si vous avez d'autres questions au professeur Heinrich. C'est bon? Donc, thank you very much, Professor Heinrich, for this excellent presentation. I'm so happy to meet you. We will have your
Excuse me,
discussion after.
j'ai one question, please. Yes, please, for me.
Of course.
Sorry, I will speak in French. Because you talk on your speech, you talk about the protocole de Nagoya. So I will continue in French. Pensez-vous que le protocole de Nagoya, tel qu'il est implémenté en ce moment dans différents pays, va conduire réellement à une conservation des ressources biologiques?
No. Thank you for this very important question. I think, as you say in English, you open a bag of worms. You open a very important area. I have very little experience in this region, with the exception of the Morocco project, as I said, about implementing the Nagoya Protocol. Just before the pandemic, we had a meeting of experts from 8 countries in South and Central America. Chile, Mexico, Panama, Guatemala, and some other ones. We did a so-called SWOT analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of the individual countries. Afterwards, we did a project in Guatemala. I didn't report on it today, and it was also to some degree a bit of a victim to the pandemic. We couldn't do all the interactions in person we had planned. But the important message was the infrastructure in place was simply not adequate to enable development. If you compare Panama and Guatemala, Panama has a mechanism in place which allows them to collaborate reasonably well. In Guatemala, they passed a decree, not a law, but a presidential decree about 15 or now 20 years ago, where they said that 50% of all benefits have to go back to the country. If you start a discussion with any company, be it small or big, they say 50%. That's not realistic. And of all revenues, even worse. It's an early stage development of largely unknown species. So Guatemala has kicked itself out of the competition with Panama in this, if you want, ecosystem. We have issues with enforcement in many countries and control. I mentioned the point earlier that we had somebody from an African country getting some plant material in good faith with agreements between the universities in place, but not the signature of the competent authority of this country. Now, this should not happen. And as I said, this paper then didn't go forward for exactly this reason. So, the national implementation, I have no idea how it works in Morocco, so I cannot and do not want to comment at all. But I'm very conscious that a lot depends on having a just but also feasible system. And I'm happy to talk about sort of a framework what's needed for this. But I think in part the problem we had, and today we are much better than we were, let's say, now over 10 years ago when Nagoya was just implemented. People were, or even, let's go back further after the CBD. Some countries claim they were sitting on gold mines. And these gold mines don't exist because you need to develop a product out of something initial. Research and development is crucial. So we need a staged approach. And I wrote a paper together with an IP attorney about 8 or 9 years ago. And our main argument was it's not so much about having everything in place about the commercialization, but in essence agree on material transfer. What can I do as a researcher, and importantly, what can I not do? So I can do some research, but this then needs to be approved by the partner organization in the provider country. So maybe think less about the big aim at the end, but think about the immediate steps and build up on this. So there's a lot of room, and in the end we have to be realistic. We have over 190 countries. Nearly all of them have signed the CBD. A large share hasn't signed the Nagoya yet. And it remains a very conflict-ridden area. And as long as we don't have signatures from some key countries, it'll be very problematic also. Sorry that it's not a yes.
I think that it's time to finish this session. Thank you very much, Professor Heinrich, for this good and excellent presentation.